There's no perfect posture because our bodies are designed to move, and so it's really important to get up regularly. Either it's through the alternation of a sit-stand workstation or even just getting out and go for a short walk at least every hour. Movement is critical for the body because even the best posture, we're going to fatigue.
Dr. Linda Miller, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
You bring a ton of experience in the space of ergonomics. I'm really curious just about maybe to get started with your background. How did you get to where you are today? I find with safety in a lot of fields, nobody has one story on how they got to the space.
Well, I started in occupational therapy, and in the 4th year of my education, I heard about this area of ergonomics, and I thought, this is kind of really where I want to put my efforts towards it. So I ended up practicing for a very short while in occupational therapy and then doing a master's in environmental design. And so my first big project that came out of that was actually in a lumber mill where I was working with people that were grading lumber. And we wanted to look at how we could reduce injuries that were associated with the wrist. So that was the first step. And then I decided to work for the Workers' Compensation Board for a couple of years, which was a great experience. And then probably about 2 years after that, I decided to go into my own private practice, and that's where I started my company.
And it's called EWI Works,
yeah,
right?
It's called EWI Works.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I guess, for myself, I'm coming into this. I don't know a ton about ergonomics. What is ergonomics at a fundamental level?
So what I always kind of equated is that we try to design the work and the workplace, the equipment people are going to use to actually optimize the human. So to make sure it fits a variety of people, it's actually within their strength capability. It actually makes sense how they can operate equipment, but it's designed for the human so that not only are they healthy and safe, but they're actually more productive. Right. So it's more around the design of the system, the environment, and then the work that people do.
And so what makes for, because that's an interesting way to describe it, design for a human. What makes for good ergonomic design? What are some key factors that you look at?
Well, there's a lot of diversity in our population, and one of the ones that I always think is the easiest one for us to actually connect with is we have differences in size and stature. So if I have something that I'm working on a workbench and it's designed for somebody really tall, I'm going to end up having somebody overreach, or they're going to end up standing on their tiptoes in worst case scenario. And so just having adjustability to meet everybody's needs for size and stature, that's one example. Another example might be strength. So instead of always designing it for the top 10% of the population for strength, let's look at actually designing for more of the population, and it allows then more people to be able to do it, males, females. And it also tackles aging as well, because we have changes as we age as well in terms of strength, flexibility. And so designing for a broader part of the population allows more people to do the work. Right.
And in terms of communicating the importance of these to people, obviously, I think that there probably needs to be more work done on getting the word out there. When you're talking to leaders that maybe don't take ergonomics seriously, or it isn't the first thought on their mind, what are some of the key points that you usually discuss with them to bring it to the forefront, the importance of good ergonomic design?
So lots of people think about costs related to actually bringing in good design, but a lot of times we'll see injuries that are related to having poor design, and so we certainly have medical costs that are associated with it. People may be off of work because of that, but more importantly, I often can bring them right back to the fact that if people can see what they're doing, they can actually reach what they're doing, and they can physically perform it, they're going to be able to do it more efficiently as well. And so it has a direct effect on the bottom line as well.
And there's all this trickle down almost that you wouldn't necessarily think of the first time, right? Yeah. When it comes to stories that obviously you've worked with many different organizations, what are some standouts of times where you went in, your organization was able to identify key risks that were in place and then improvements that you were able to make?
So from an office side, for instance, a lot of times people's jobs have become much more sedentary. So even giving people the option to now have sit-to-stand workstations or having the ability to have a chair that fits them, all of that actually affects how comfortable somebody is and also how they're able to attend to the task as well. So having that flexibility in their workstations makes a huge difference from a comfort standpoint. That's one. Another one that I was involved with is actually working on, and this is a long time ago, was actually looking at the need for height adjustable beds in hospitals.
And that wasn't a standard?
No, years ago, 25 years ago, most beds were crank adjustable. But you think people are under a lot of pressure to get work done. And so a lot of times people would work in really forward bent postures or stoop postures. They didn't have time to actually adjust beds. And so even having an electric bed helped, nurses actually do care around the bed or other professionals to do care around the bed. And then certainly looking at a lot of the mobile lifting equipment that was introduced into hospitals. We were quite involved with that as well. And certainly we see lots of mobile equipment now being introduced into a variety of environments, industrially as well.
It's crazy to think that wasn't standard procedure, that these were things that had to be thought of and maybe weren't in place, right? I mean, when you go to a hospital now, every bed, at least in,
it is.
This part of the world, it's pretty much standard that we're able to adjust these. But what a quality of life change that would make.
Yeah, huge change.
For the individual.
Yeah.
When it comes to the basics, good posture, sitting at a desk all day, it can be a little bit tough to remember these things. What are some tips or tricks that you have, because you're somebody that thinks about this a lot, to remind ourselves, because it's very easy in the day to forget. And even when you mentioned good posture, I kind of sat up a little bit straighter, right? So do you have any advice for people?
So I talk to people about making sure their feet are supported, first of all. So you want to make sure you have your chair either low enough and actually having your feet on the floor surface. If you don't have a height adjustable workstation, then you might have to raise your chair and you might have to support your feet on a footrest. Mm-hmm. The next thing is that you want to always make sure that your input devices like your keyboard and mouse are about elbow height when you're sitting or standing. And then you want to think about also your monitor height. So you want to make sure the top of the screen is about eye level and about arm's length away, and make sure that you have good back support from your chair. But I always talk to people about there's no perfect posture because our bodies are designed to move, and so it's really important to get up regularly. Either it's through the alternation of a sit-stand workstation or even just getting out and go for a short walk at least every hour.
Some sort of variation there, it seems like, is the key.
Yeah, movement is critical for the body because even the best posture, we're going to fatigue in that posture and start to create a bit of discomfort.
So when it comes to, I have a standing desk, right?
Yeah.
And I, for a while, was only standing, and I noticed that was causing myself a little bit of strain. Do you recommend, and from the sounds of it, maybe switching it up, a little bit of sitting, a little bit of standing?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We want to switch it up because it's actually hard to stand continuously in one spot. You'll have people report lower back pain. They'll even lock the knees sometimes, and then they start to even have issues with their hips. And so I always try to get people to try to see if you can always get that movement created with postural change. And a lot of the evidence doesn't suggest it's a 1-to-1 ratio, so half an hour sitting, half an hour standing. We can tolerate a little bit more sitting than we can standing. So I often talk to people about maybe 30 to 45 minutes sitting and about 10 to 15 minutes standing, and then getting that walk break in.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So being able to switch it up,
yes,
and change is key. I've heard there's so many different sayings that go around. Sitting is the new smoking,
yeah,
and being one of them. As somebody who knows the research, how true is that statement?
So sitting is not the new smoking. It's the fact that we've become very sedentary. So a lot of our jobs now, if I ask somebody how much time are you actually at your computer workstation, they'll say to me, in the past it was maybe 4 hours a day. Now it's 7 out of the 8 hours. And so there's very little task variation. And so the body isn't getting that active movement. And then when we talk to people about their activities outside of work, they're often talking to me, well, I'll game at home, or, I'll end up watching TV. If you're in a sedentary job, now physical activity becomes more important.
Right.
Especially outside of work.
And when it comes to the risks of not implementing these things, let's say I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, well, how important could this be? What's at risk here when people decide not to keep an active lifestyle or implement good ergonomic techniques?
Well, heart-wise, there's always that risk because you don't have that cardio activity. But there's also the strengthening piece that if you don't keep your body strong, you're going to start to see strength reduce and flexibility. So a lot of the people I often will see, they'll say, I have lower back pain. And, when I start to look at their posture, they sit in a very rounded posture. Or if they're working off their laptop, they sit again with a really forward bent posture, neck bent forward. And then let's not forget texting. And we end up in these very forward bent postures. And people are treated regularly for upper back and neck pain because of these postures.
And sometimes when treatment includes surgery, it includes invasive procedures.
Yeah.
Speaking about surgery, I know that you've worked with surgeons.
I have.
Can you talk a little bit? That's such a fascinating thing that I guess wouldn't come to mind first for a lot of people when they think of ergonomics and posture, but these people are in various positions throughout the day.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about the work you're doing with them?
So there's a lot of risk actually associated with surgery, especially for surgical teams. And when we've actually looked at the research associated with surgeons, there's a high reports of lower back pain, very high reports of neck discomfort, and hand and wrist problems. And if you really look at a lot of the postures, they're static. They're holding them for long periods of time. They are often standing in one spot. And then you have to think about where are they actually looking. They might be looking to screens that are above the surgical table. They might be looking off to one side if there's another type of screen that might be positioned. And then a lot of times they're looking down in order to actually perform the surgery. Fast forward to a lot of the new introduction with a lot of the robotics that we see in surgical environments as well. Yeah, it's reduced some of the standing, but now we still have a lot of forward bent postures just associated with setup and very static. So,
and when it comes to the main issues that you're seeing in that particular occupation, what are some of the main complaints that you see? Is it back pain? Is it
back and neck? And what's really fascinating when we look at the rate of surgeons, it's actually almost identical to construction workers in terms of reports.
Wow.
Yeah. But it's the very static nature and very bent postures that they're often taking on. And it's for extended periods of time. So it might not be excessive lifting and pushing, pulling, carrying that you see often on a construction site, but they can be very static postures that are held for long periods of time.
So what I'm hearing is these are things that apply to almost everybody. And it's a universal thing.
Yeah.
Is that what you found?
Absolutely. I see dentists, I see dental hygienists, that will be in very awkward postures under high force. I see people working in design studios, computers, when they're working with that. A lot of times on utility sites, there's lots of application for ergonomics across the industry.
And in terms of technology, I know that this is a space that is rapidly advancing. We hear terms like AI being thrown around, all different kinds of ways that we can go about tracking and implementing and measuring. What are some of the exciting technological advancements that you're seeing or maybe even working on in your space?
Yeah, so there's lots happening actually with AI right now, and there's sensors people are wearing. There's reminders with the sensors. We're working on a product right now where you can take a video that actually can look at the potential risk associated with the task. So it's a AI tool that you can upload a video of someone working, and it will actually map over where high-risk postures. So there's lots of technologies out there. It's now how are we going to use them? And so a lot of times it's going to help us to identify the problem, but we really have to move from just the problem to how do you fix it.
Right. And
Yeah.
there's an interesting part of human psychology here where things that are immediately going to cause us pain, we're often going to react to, right? Whereas things that build up over time, such as poor posture, it's very easy, at least from what I've seen, to kind of push that down the road, right?
Yeah.
Or not be too concerned about that. Is that something that you're seeing as well?
Yeah,
in
you
your
see
space?
that. And I think the other thing that's interesting is often also when people have the pain resolve, they might go back to old habits or old behaviors as well. And so, again, it's really trying to create that culture that you make sure that people have the adjustability, they understand, they know what tools they should be using to reduce forces even in the workplace, and then make sure that they're part of just day-to-day use so that they're integrated into your safety programs.
Right. And when it comes to safety programs, a lot of it can be just checklists, and people go through and say, "Oh, I'm following the procedure," blah blah blah. How much of this has a psychological perspective to it when it comes to ergonomics or safety in general?
So I always think about, like, a lot of these checklists are great. They're going to identify, concerns or hazards. But if you have somebody that's out there and they're working on a day-to-day basis, even just as a supervisor, stopping them, reminding them of the right techniques, making sure that they're using the right equipment, making sure that if they're actually getting into at-risk behavior, that maybe take a step back and start to ask the question, is there a better and safer way to do it? So I believe a lot of this is all culturally driven within a company. And then really making sure that when we identify ways to solve a problem, that it's actually easy to use that solution.
Right. Finding something that makes sense
Yeah.
for the space that you're in.
Yeah.
For people that might find themselves in a culture and environment where they notice that there's unsafe postures or unsafe work environments or poor
Yeah.
design, what are some of those first steps that someone can take to bring that up? Because it's not always easy, right?
Yeah, I think more and more, because it's getting into the popular media, people are willing to ask for better workstations. They're asking for lifting equipment. I also know our regulations are getting more and more developed where, we'll have officers come out and actually evaluate the ergonomics of a work site or the manual handling. So it is becoming more part of our narrative, and it's not something just a nice to have anymore. And I always tell people, like, it's interesting to talk to somebody that's had proper equipment in the past, and if they go to a different environment or maybe even a temporary move and they don't have it, it's pretty interesting how quick it comes up again. And people will say, you know what? I had a good chair, or I had a good workstation, or I had carts that I can move things. And once, people get used to it, it's easier to obviously bring it up. But I think also the media has really helped to support it as well, so that we know that there are fixes out there and we don't have to work in pain.
Exactly. Yeah, and seeing that there's often, I'm sure either if you go from not having it to having it or having it to not having it, both ways,
Yeah.
there's clearly something fundamental that's important here in the workspace that's going on, that when it's missing, it's going to have a absolutely detrimental effect. Are there any stories that stick out in your mind of, like you gave some examples there, but where somebody was either doing something incorrectly, there was a change made, and then there was a benefit, or the other way around, where they had a detrimental effect after the fact? Is there anything that kind of comes out to you from your time?
You know what? I would still remember a story, and it was actually a project that was, our group was on, and they were looking at the use of. It was actually an exoskeleton. It was a false frame that goes. It's a frame that goes onto the body to help support some of the weights when people are working. And the individual said to one of the researchers, he said, "This is the first day I'll be able to go home and probably play with my son."
Wow.
And the researcher was kind of surprised, and he said, what do you mean? He says, well, most days I get home and I'm in pain. And I just thought, wow, like that's huge. If you can actually go home and you've done a good day's work, but you don't have to go home in pain, and you can still have your activities outside of work.
It's life-changing,
Yeah,
fundamentally.
spend time with your family. That's what we want.
These are things that people take for granted, but being able to do that is huge. Knowing all of this, right?
Yeah.
In your own life, as somebody who is like very experienced in this space, how do you yourself implement what you know in your day-to-day?
Well, first of all, I'm a cyclist on top of it, so I'm not very good, let's be honest, but I really enjoy it. And what's so interesting was before I actually got a bike fitted to me, I used to think, wow, I don't know if I really like this cycling. But all of a sudden when I got it fitted, it was like, wow, I love this sport. It's great. So I'm very mindful now that if I take on a sport, that I actually get it fitted to my body rather than just grab something and hope it's going to fit and hope I'm going to enjoy it. So that's one thing I try to do quite regularly. But I also have to always kind of catch myself because I'm in a role of leadership, and sometimes I do get very focused and I don't get away from my workstation, and I have to do that inventory to say, okay, did you take your breaks today? Did you actually alternate your activity in terms of sitting and standing? And then the other one that I have to catch myself is to say, okay, how many steps did you actually do today? And it's shocking sometimes. You go, oh my, that's pretty low. And it's that continual inventory sometimes you have to take yourself and actually ask, are you actually practicing what you preach?
And I love that you bring up the number of steps. I recently got into running, and so that's been on my mind quite a lot. I want to know, because I've heard many numbers thrown around, what is the optimal number of steps, and is there?
You know what? It's interesting because everybody wonders where that 10,000 steps comes from. We don't really know. It was a suggestion of a goal. And I think the big thing that I always talk to people about is try to start just seeing how much activity you get in a day. And if it's running pretty low, 1,000, 2,000, see if you can push it to 2,500. Then see if you can push it to 3,000. And just see if you can start getting yourself to get more activity into your workday. And it doesn't always have to be steps. Sometimes it might be through cycling, it might be through dancing, it might be through something completely different, or swimming. But it's about getting more movement into the workday or into your day.
And seeing where you're at.
Yeah, and see where the first part of the baseline is. And it's interesting because they've done a lot of review of people working from home and people tracking their steps, and which is really interesting. For some people, yeah, they were great. They got out and did regular walks at lunch. But we often see very low step counts when people work from home because they don't have the commute that's associated with getting dressed, going to the car, or taking transit. Getting up into the office tower, going out for lunch if they, are going to take a walk or go and get lunch. And so just getting that baseline to see where you sit and start to ask the question, maybe is there an opportunity to get more movement?
Let's talk a little bit more about work from home, because COVID recently was a perfect example of where this huge shift happened. I know you brought up some of the factors there, but working from home, what were the key challenges, especially with a large part of the workforce transitioning there, that you saw during that time?
Well, I think there was a lot of equity issues, first of all, because there were some people that had, a dedicated office. They had a good workstation set up at home. And so, yes, they had the whole shift to working from home, and they had to deal with technologies. But they had pretty good, desks and chairs. Then we had this whole other group that didn't have that as an opportunity. Either they had small spaces or they were sharing space with partners or kids. And then where were you going to find actually a place to actually set yourself up? Some people were on a dining room table. Others were on sofas. Others, they even talked to people working off a set of stairs even, because that was the only place they could find that was quiet. And so we really went from having good adjustable equipment to really limited adjustable equipment, and many people working off of laptops, which are really not well suited for long work.
Wow. Off of the stairs is just, I can't imagine how much pain that would cause just in the day-to-day. And in terms of research that's going on right now, this is probably a space that you have just a ton more knowledge than most people do. What is some of the most exciting research that's going on right now in this space?
Is that with work from home or?
Not just with work from home, from ergonomics in general.
I think, well, we've talked a lot about the physical side of it, but there's a lot of work being done on the psychosocial cognitive side as well. And when you think that a lot of jobs now have a significant amount of computer use, we're actually looking at how do we use these programs, how do we present them so that people can actually use them effectively and not feel that overload. How do we actually structure a work day to reflect that we have lots of people that are working, partial shifts. So
Right.
there's
And burnout becomes an issue.
burnout. So there's, ergonomics really looks at the whole person and the whole system. So we're seeing a lot of work being done around that psychological and cognitive side. And then the other piece is that we are looking at a lot more use of AI. And even some of these, passive, what we call exoskeletons, to see if we can reduce some of the loads. But a lot of this is quite early in terms of how we can actually roll it out into a workplace. The cognitive stuff is much more developed. But around exoskeletons, there's still lots that has to be done about matching it to the right task, as well as getting people to adopt it, because we have to then think about the PPE they have to wear. Or, if they're going to have to drive, are they going to have to take it off? Like, there's lots of things that we still have to work through.
And for the exoskeletons, what are some of the key industries? Obviously, construction would be one that these would be implemented in.
So they're actually adopted quite heavily now in manufacturing. So you see them quite a bit in automotives. You'll see them in a lot of different facilities in, standard factory type environments. Construction, it's early, and there's a lot of work being done around how they can be used. We do have to negotiate the fact that they're working outside. They have a lot of different tasks, and so we have to think about how do they fit. Are they working with their personal protective equipment? What are they going to do if they want to take a break? Are they going to have to take it off? So there's things that are being negotiated, but the cool thing is that we're actually in process of taking it from the lab out into the actual workplace and working with people and getting feedback.
That's got to be so exciting to see that impact. It's also got to be tremendously meaningful to be able to work on something in the lab and then bring it out and see the actual improvement that's going on in the real world.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, though, is you start to realize, let's find the best solution, not just find a situation where the exoskeleton is going to work. So a lot of times when we go out and we think that might be a solution, we even find a better solution. That might be a different piece of equipment or a different way to do it. So again, it's like looking for the best solution to reduce risk.
And what are some of the processes that you go about to find the best solution, like the thought that goes into it? Because it's not easy always coming to that conclusion, right?
No, I think a lot of times, we'll obviously do assessments, but one of the biggest things is to spend time with the workers and start to ask them where are the pain points, in the sense of what they find challenging, what are the most physically demanding or mentally demanding tasks, what things frustrate them in order to get something done. And then ask them, what ideas do you have? And a lot of times they already have a lot of really good ideas. We might be working with engineering just to refine them further, or making sure that we're not introducing a new risk. But a lot of times it's bringing all those key stakeholders together.
It's a great point that you bring up, and something that I've been thinking about too is collective experience. And when we think about all the people that work at a given work site or space, you combine all of the hours of experience. One person might have 10 years, another person might have 8 years. You ask both of them, now you've got 18 years, right? You ask the whole company, you've got thousands of years of experience. Bringing that together is tremendously valuable, and I'm sure speeds up the process of.
It does, but I think the other huge thing is that when you get people participating in the process of looking for not only the problems but the solutions, then they feel like they have more of a buy-in. And not only are we going to look at potential solutions, but then we're going to have to bring them back and actually trial them and see, okay, do we need to modify it in some way? How do we make it work even better? And there's kind of that iterative process where you go in that feedback loop and monitor to see, what is it actually effectively solving the problem.
And earning the buy-in is something that I think is a really interesting term that you bring up, because when they feel like they're engaged in the process, they're going to want to contribute more, and it's almost like a snowball effect in a way.
Yeah, and I also think that's where even our opportunity for AI is going as well, is that it's going to help us identify solutions that maybe worked in another industry. And now all of a sudden we might take something from construction and apply it into manufacturing, or we might take it from like a hospital environment to another environment, maybe a laboratory. But, it's really thinking, let's see where we have solutions out there, and maybe we have it applicable to another environment, and we just have to refine it further.
You mentioned another key thing that you brought up earlier was not only the psychological aspect of things, but specifically burnout.
Yes.
And I think that that's a term that's used a lot. And I think it's important that it's probably clearly defined. What exactly is burnout?
Well, they talk a lot about the fact that people have been, trying to keep up with work demands. They haven't been necessarily taking the breaks to actually recuperate, and the body mentally and physically gets very overwhelmed and fatigued. And so I'm sure there's a really formal definition of it, but when I talk to people that have been diagnosed with burnout, they'll often talk about that they're so tired. They have difficulty initiating tasks, and they often will tell me about the pattern that led up to that. So they weren't often taking breaks. They were often saying yes and not always knowing how much demand it was going to be placed onto them. And they were trying to make sure that they were keeping up with their workload at work, but also they might have also not been also managing some of the demands even outside of work. So,
and there's clearly safety impacts here when we think of burnout. Imagine somebody is in a position where they have to make critical decisions. Have you seen this firsthand in organizations where it creates an unsafe environment?
You know what? I think I've seen it more related to fatigue, really, to be honest, and people might bypass a process, or they might make a decision that they haven't got all the information for, and it puts them at risk or puts their team at risk. Where I've seen more of the burnout impact people is that they often will feel like they're not really the most effective worker, or they might just try to get a task done. And so, there are safety risks associated with burnout, but I also see that it really affects that individual's health and overall performance on the job as well.
So how do we go about fixing it? What are some of the key steps here that if we're in a position where we feel like, or we've gotten in the habit of constantly saying yes and taking on more, and we notice this pattern for ourselves, and you can, like you said, clearly identify the points that led up to this. What are those first steps that we can take to avoiding it and breaking the cycle?
Well, I think first of all, we need to get our organizations educated on what workload is. And it's not just physical workload, but there's a lot of cognitive workload often associated with administrative type work or project-based type work. And getting people to understand that, this is a condition, there are signs and symptoms, and really start to create a understanding that, there's ways to prevent this. And so if we can start the conversation, that often helps us identify things early, and then create that open dialogue that a supervisor or an employee can talk together about workload, how we might even change a job, or even how we might even have to start to restructure a job.
And when it comes to that restructuring, how much of this is up to leadership versus the employees? Is this a top-down effort? Is this a collective effort?
I believe it should be a collective effort. Because again, I think there's a lot of times that the frontline employee is going to find ways that will help reduce some of that load. But if they don't have a management team that's willing to talk about it, it's very hard to say, I need a change. I need to modify this. I might need more help. And if you don't have that culture to be able to actually talk about when you need supports, it's not going to necessarily happen.
And in my mind, taking that first step is probably going to be the most difficult. But once you get that ball rolling down the hill, it probably becomes a lot easier to identify other issues that might be in an organization and easier to create change.
Yeah, and I always think it's also really important for both sides to kind of think about what are some of the solutions. And then it creates an opportunity rather than this is a barrier. And I think if we can actually have a good and solid narrative around when workload is high or if somebody is having trouble keeping up, or even if they're missing breaks, then we can start to see, okay, what are some ways that we can now introduce some ways to reduce some of the demand on the person.
And bring that down to a reasonable level. And do you see, just like you mentioned earlier, just as there's physical differences with everyone, I'm sure that there's different capacities in terms of workload for most people.
Yeah, and also what we can tolerate. So I'll give you a good example. When I got right out of university, I could tolerate quite a bit. I could do a lot of workload. But then I became a new mom. And all of a sudden, I'm not sleeping, or I'm trying to make sure that everything's going okay at home. And there are times in our lives that our personal lives are pretty heavy, and that can create a demand. So I think if we look at the person as a whole person, that's when we can actually prevent some of this as well.
A holistic view that takes in many different factors. And it's fascinating that this is when I, first thought of ergonomics as a concept. I think, at least in my mind, I just thought of a good chair or a good posture, but from what I'm hearing, there's so much more.
Yeah, there's a lot more. Yeah. And the opportunity for people to really thrive. And I always think a lot of times people, most people want to work, and that gives them the freedom for financial opportunities, to have independence. It gives them a lot of sense of purpose. And so when we can actually look at the person as a whole person and really allow them to like what they do and thrive at what they do, we can really then create a really sustainable workforce.
For the leaders that are hearing this message, which I think is incredibly important, for them, where would you recommend that they start to approach this conversation about creating a holistic viewpoint of the worker and the workspace? What are some of the places that we can start having these conversations?
So the thing that I want to highlight is we're already having them, which is really cool, because I think, again, a lot of people are talking about both physical health and mental health, and it's become a lot more acceptable to talk about the whole person, the whole environment, how we actually support workers. And there's a number of companies that are doing extremely well on that front. And then it's to be able to really start to ask the question, have we provided our employees the tools to do their jobs? And, a lot of times it might be the proper setup of a workstation. It might be the tools and equipment if they're in an automotive shop. But it's really asking those questions, are we allowing them to thrive in that environment?
It's great that there's a place where we can start with this, right? And just having that, broaching the conversation initially, I think is going to be a huge piece to this, because if you don't, it's never gonna happen. When it comes to your work at your organization, what are some of the key things or efforts that are going on right now in your space?
We have a lot of younger workers that are coming to us, and often we're the first employer. And so just even taking the time to kind of orientate them always to the nature of the work that they're doing, making sure that they understand the risks and hazards associated with the types of work that they're doing, making sure they're introduced to the equipment in order to make sure they're set up properly if they're working in the office, if they're out on a work site, making sure that they have the proper safety training and PPE. And then really just creating that culture of care. And that's really what we try to do as an organization, and try to move that out into the workforce when we work with employers.
And just get it out there and make sure that it's not just learn about it one day, forget about it the next kind of thing.
Yeah.
And making sure that these are things that we can implement day in, day out, far into the future, right?
Yeah, and I think we've gotten better is instead of just training the worker how to deal with the hazard, we're really getting much better at actually addressing the hazard and the risk by how we design our workplace, how we actually provide people the proper manual handling aids. And so we are getting better, that we're looking at a joint responsibility, that there is the worker responsibility, but there is also the employer's responsibility as well.
And working collectively to kind of
collectively.
build that up.
Yeah.
I can tell that you're very passionate about this. You've obviously thought about this for a long, long time. In your work, what are some of the key sources of meaning or areas where you see the most value in the work that you do?
So because I'm in business, I love to see businesses thrive. And when I see businesses thrive, it's usually when I see there's a good work culture and they've really taken care of their employees, and they've taken care of the fact that, they've set up the work so that the people can go home safe at night and go and live their lives, and they stay connected to that employer. So for me, that's what I guess I thrive off of, is that I can see people actually liking what they do, they feel safe at what they do, and they're proud of the fact that they are a mechanic or they're a nurse or whatever they take on as a career, and they've got that support.
And being able to continue what they want to do for much longer.
And go into retirement healthy.
Right. And be able to enjoy that time that everyone talks about it, but by the time that you get to that age or that point in your life, I'm sure you've seen this plenty of times where they aren't able to enjoy that time.
Yeah,
right?
I started actually even my career in mining, and it's pretty heavy work. And it's interesting how many people I talked to after they retired where they, couldn't golf anymore, or they couldn't actually, a lot of the guys were fishing, and they said, I can't even cast because my shoulders are so bad. So we're not just working for the sake of working. We want to have a full life, and then we also want that retirement.
I've heard a term thrown around, and I'm curious if you have as well, health span. And this is something that I think is crucial for everyone to at least understand as a concept. The idea that there's lifespan and there's health span. And lifespan is how long you live, and then health span, and I think this is kind of what you're speaking to, is how long are you going to be healthy for? And there's some shocking statistics, and I'd love to hear if you have any more to add to this, but I've heard that on average, the average individual will spend 10 years in some sort of chronic illness, and that just shocks me.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's a lot of employees even out in Canadian workforce that have what we call episodic disability, where they might have, episode that may be related to their arthritis, or they might have MS, or they might have, even some other illness that might affect their performance. So there's lots of people that, have health, but there are a lot of people in our environment that don't always have full health. And ideally, when we can actually look at preventing injury or illness, that's going to expand that health span. Other times we might not always have those opportunities, but certainly when we can look at how we design our lives in terms of our work, but how we eat, how we move, all of that does contribute to that health span.
It doesn't just start and end at the workplace.
No, it's outside of work as well.